He didn't say goodbye. That was the thing that stayed with me longest, not the phone call, not the drive to the hospital, not standing in that empty parking lot at 2 a.m. trying to remember how to breathe. It was the fact that my Uncle David hadn't said goodbye to anyone, because there was no one there to say goodbye to, except me. And I had been 3 states away, asleep, when it happened. I found out the way you find out about things that shouldn't happen over a phone, my mother called, said the words, and then immediately started talking about logistics, arrangements, whether anyone needed to fly in. She said the last part with a particular kind of lightness that told me she already knew the answer. Nobody would need to fly in. Nobody had been planning to visit anyway. I was 26 when Uncle David died. He was 61 years old, and he had lived alone in a small house outside of Clarksville, Tennessee for the last 9 years of his life. The house had 3 rooms, a front porch with a broken screen door, and a yard that he kept mowed with a kind of mechanical precision that I always found quietly impressive. Everything about him was like that, precise, contained, like a man who had learned long ago that the world didn't need to know what he was thinking. My mother's brother. That's how people usually introduced him when he came around, which was not often. This is David, my brother, and then the conversation would move on, because David was not a man who gave you much to work with socially. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't talk about his work, or his past, or where he had been. He would sit at the edge of whatever room the family had gathered in, hold a glass of sweet tea without drinking it, and watch, not in a creepy way, just in the way of someone who had learned to observe things very carefully and had never really stopped. The last time I saw him in person was 2 Christmases before he died. He drove up to my parents' house in Georgia, sat through dinner, helped my father carry boxes into the attic without being asked, and then left before dessert. My brother Marcus didn't notice he was gone until an hour later. My mother said something about how he had always been like that. My father changed the subject. I was the only one who ever called him. Not consistently, life has a way of pulling you in too many directions, but every few months I would dial his number and he would pick up on the second ring, and we would talk for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. Books. The weather in Tennessee. Whether the Braves had any shot that season. He would ask about my job. I would ask about his garden. He had started growing tomatoes a few years back, and he talked about them with more warmth than he talked about almost anything else. He never talked about the army. I knew he had served. You don't grow up in a family without picking up certain things. There were photographs when he was young, a serious face under a beret, broad shoulders in a uniform that I didn't know how to read. My grandmother, before she passed, mentioned once that David had done important work and then looked out the window and didn't say anything else. When I was 12, I asked my mother directly, and she said he had been in special forces or something with a vagueness that suggested she genuinely didn't know or hadn't asked. I didn't know until much later that those 2 possibilities were very different things. He retired at 41. That struck me as young, even then. He never explained it. He bought the house in Clarksville, started the garden, and that was that. He had a pension. He had a truck that was 10 years old and ran perfectly because he maintained it the way he maintained everything in his life, with quiet, steady attention. He went to the same diner every Tuesday morning. The woman who worked the counter there, Sandra, called him by his first name and had his coffee ready before he sat down. I know all of this because I asked her, after. She cried when I told her. She said he had been coming in for 7 years and she didn't know his last name until she saw it in the paper. That told me something about the kind of man he was, and about the kind of family we had been. When my mother called, I asked her who else knew. "I've called Marcus," she said. "And your Aunt Linda. And of course your father knows. Is anyone going?" I asked. A pause. Not long. The kind that contains an entire answer. The funeral home said there's really not much to it, would just be a graveside service, since he didn't have a church. And with the holidays coming, it's really not a good time for everyone to— "I'll go," I said. "Sweetheart, it's a 16-hour drive." "I'll fly," I said. "I'll figure it out." Another pause, this one softer. "That's very sweet of you." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that sweet had nothing to do with it. I was going because someone had to. Because the idea of David being lowered into the ground with nobody there, not one single person who had known him, who had eaten dinner with him, who had heard his voice, was something I couldn't square with any version of the world I was willing to live in. I booked a flight that night. I drove to Clarksville the next day and met with the funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Gerald who had clearly been in the business long enough to have seen every permutation of grief and its absence. He walked me through the arrangements with a gentle efficiency that I was grateful for. He mentioned that the VA had been notified, and that there might be some coordination through them regarding burial rites. He mentioned it carefully, watching my face. He was a veteran, I said, which felt absurd to have to confirm to anyone. Yes, ma'am, Gerald said. His records indicated service. There may be some folks from the VA who participate. They usually do, for veterans. I said that would be fine. I didn't know what that meant, exactly. I found out 2 days later. The graveside service was on a Thursday. Cold. Tennessee in December has a particular kind of cold that comes up from the ground rather than down from the sky, damp and settling, the kind that gets into your joints. I wore my good coat and my nicest boots, and I stood beside a casket draped with a flag, and I was, as I had understood I would be, the only family member present. There were 2 other people, Sandra from the diner, who had driven 40 minutes and brought a small bunch of flowers she was holding in both hands, like she wasn't sure what to do with them, and an older man I didn't recognize, maybe 70, lean, wearing a VFW cap and a jacket that hung on him like it had been bought for a bigger version of himself. He stood very straight despite his age. He didn't speak to me before the service. He just stood. The pastor said some words. The VA Honor Guard, 2 young soldiers who had driven up from Fort Campbell, folded the flag with an exactness that made my throat tighten. They handed it to me because I was the only family there. The older man in the VFW cap watched this without expression. Afterward, Sandra hugged me and said she was sorry and pressed the flowers into my hands and walked back to her car. I stood for a moment beside the grave, not ready to leave. The older man approached. He had kind eyes and a face that had been weathered by more sun than Tennessee could account for. "You're his family?" he said. "His niece," I said. "I'm the only one who came." He nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Raymond Aldridge," he said, and extended his hand. I didn't know David well. We connected through the VFW a few years back. He came to maybe 4, 5 meetings. Didn't say much. But he showed up. "That sounds like him," I said. Raymond looked at the grave. "He was a good man," he said. "Private, but good." He paused. "You taking care of his things?" "I'm going to the house this afternoon," I said. "His landlord has been very patient." Raymond nodded again. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out a business card, actual cardstock, the old kind, and handed it to me. "If you find anything you're not sure about," he said, militarily speaking, "give me a call. Sometimes things need context." I didn't know what that meant. I thanked him, and he walked back to his car with that same measured straightness, and I stood alone by my uncle's grave for another few minutes before the cold finally made me move. The house was exactly as I expected and somehow smaller. He kept it clean. The kitchen was ordered in a way that suggested habit rather than fussiness, everything in its place, not because he was precious about it, but because a place for everything made things simpler. The garden was dormant for winter but clearly tended. The tomato stakes were stored neatly against the back fence. His bedroom was sparse. A bed, a nightstand, a dresser. On the nightstand was a library book, a history of the Korean War with a bookmark about 2/3 of the way through. I sat on the edge of his bed for a while and looked at that bookmark and thought about how he had been planning to finish it, how that had been a reasonable thing to expect. I packed what seemed worth keeping, some clothes for donation. The library book I would return, a small framed photograph of my grandmother that he had kept on the dresser, a pocket Bible with a cracked spine. At the back of his closet, on the highest shelf, was a shoebox. I'm not sure why I almost didn't look. Something about the way it was placed, not hidden, exactly, but set apart. Like it was meant to be there, and not meant to be disturbed. But I was the only person cleaning out this house, and whatever was in the box would end up in a landfill if I didn't look at it. So I looked. Inside was a small collection of things. A folded piece of paper with a phone number on it, no name. A photograph of 5 men in tactical gear in front of what might have been a jungle or might have been a dense forest. It was hard to tell. And none of the men were identified, and the background gave away nothing useful. My uncle was not in the photograph, or if he was, I didn't recognize him without context. There was a small wooden cross, plain and sanded smooth. A folded letter that I didn't open because it felt wrong, like reading someone's diary, and I set it aside to think about. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of dark cloth, was a coin. Not a regular coin. Larger than a quarter, thick, with a weight that felt significant when I picked it up. Brass, or something like it. On one side, an eagle with its wings spread, holding something in each talon, and text along the edge that I couldn't fully make out without better light. On the other side, a motto and a symbol I didn't recognize. The whole thing had the quality of something official, ceremonial, almost. The edges were worn in the way that comes from being handled many times over many years. I turned it over in my hand a few times. I wrapped it back in the cloth and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it had meant something to him, and until I understood what, I wasn't leaving it in a shoebox. Raymond Aldridge picked up on the third ring. I was sitting in my rental car in Uncle David's driveway, and it was almost dark, and I had been turning the coin over in my fingers without thinking about it for the last 15 minutes. I found something, I told him. A coin. Large. Brass. An eagle on one side. A silence on the other end of the line that was different from the silence of someone thinking, more like the silence of someone very carefully deciding something. "Can you describe the other side?" he asked. I unwrapped it, told him what I saw, the symbol, the text, as much as I could read. Another silence. "Where are you right now?" he said. "In his driveway. Don't leave it behind," he said. "That coin, take it with you. Take good care of it." He paused. "I'm going to make some calls. There are people who would want to know about this." "About a coin?" I said. "About David," he said quietly. "About who David was." I flew home. I went back to my apartment in Charlotte, went back to my job, went back to the particular texture of ordinary life that always feels slightly unreal in the weeks after a loss. I put the coin in the drawer of my nightstand, next to the library book, which I had paid the lost book fee for because I couldn't bring myself to return it without finishing it first. My mother called once to ask how the service went. I said it was fine. I said he would have liked it being quiet. She said that was good and then asked if I had made any decisions about Christmas. Marcus sent a text 3 weeks later. "Sorry, I couldn't make it down." How was everything? I read it and put my phone face down on the counter and didn't answer until the next morning because I needed the night to make sure I would answer without saying something I couldn't take back. Raymond called me in January. "I talked to some people," he said. "There's a man who would like to speak with you, if you're willing." He said he knew your uncle. "What kind of man?" I asked. "Retired Army," Raymond said. "He's asked me not to say more than that over the phone." He paused. "I know how that sounds. But I've known him a long time. He's trustworthy." I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 4 days. I called Raymond back and said yes. We met at a diner outside of Fort Bragg, which is called something else now, but which everyone in that world still calls Fort Bragg. The man Raymond had mentioned was already there when I arrived, a booth in the back corner, coffee in front of him, reading nothing, just sitting with the stillness of someone who had learned to wait without fidgeting. He stood when I approached. Tall, late 60s, silver-haired, a handshake that was firm without making a point of it. He said his name was Thomas. He didn't offer a last name and I didn't ask. We sat. I ordered coffee. He watched me take the coin out of my bag and set it on the table between us. His face did something then that I wasn't expecting. Not drama, no sharp intake of breath, no theatrical reaction. Something quieter and more complicated. His jaw tightened. He looked at the coin for a long moment, and then he looked at me. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In his closet," I said. "In a shoebox. At the back." He nodded slowly. He reached out and picked it up with a care that told me everything I needed to know about its weight before he said a single word about it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "No," I said. He turned it over in his fingers the way I had done, in the driveway, in the dark. "Your uncle served in the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment," he said. He paused to let that land. "Most people call it Delta Force, though that's not a term we use." He said the last part without any particular emphasis, not coy, not showing off, just accurate. He served for 16 years. He retired as a master sergeant. His service record the parts that exist as a record lists him as a training instructor. The rest of what he did. He set the coin down on the table between us, carefully. The rest is still classified. I sat with that for a moment. My family didn't know. I said. No, he said. They wouldn't have. That was intentional. He chose not to tell people. And in his line of work, that choice was also a kind of professional discipline. The men he served with, they don't talk about it. Not because they're forbidden to, though sometimes they are, but because they understand something about the value of quiet. He paused. Some of them carry it for so long that the quiet becomes who they are. They don't know how to put it down. I thought about David at Christmas dinner with a glass of sweet tea he never drank. David mowing his lawn with mechanical precision. David asking about my job and my car and my life with a steady, genuine attention that I had always appreciated without fully understanding. He was watching out for us, I said. And I wasn't sure where the thought came from, but as soon as I said it, I knew it was true in some way I couldn't articulate. Thomas looked at me. That's what they do, he said. That's what all of them do. In the end, they spend their whole careers watching out for people who will never know their names. Why are you here? I said. Why did you want to meet me? He picked up the coin again. Because David was one of ours, he said simply. And because when one of ours goes without family present, without people who understand what he gave, it matters. To us, the ones still here. He set the coin down in front of me. This is a unit coin. It doesn't leave the family. He kept it, which means he wanted it kept. I wanted you to know what you're holding. I looked at the coin, the eagle, the worn edges. What did he do? I said. Specifically, can you tell me anything? Thomas was quiet for a moment. He saved lives, he said finally. A lot of them. In places that don't appear on the itinerary of anything officially sanctioned. He made decisions under conditions that most people will never understand, and he made them correctly. And he came home, and he never asked anyone to acknowledge it. He paused. He was one of the best operators I ever worked with, and I want you to know that, even if no one else in your family ever does. I drove home from Fort Bragg with the coin in my coat pocket, and my hands very steady on the wheel and my eyes dry right up, until I pulled off the highway into a rest stop in South Carolina and sat in the parking lot for a while. I called my mother. She picked up after 2 rings. She could tell from my voice that something had happened, and to her credit, she asked what was wrong before assuming anything. I found out who David was, I said. What he did in the army. A silence. What do you mean? I told her. Not all of it, some of it I wouldn't repeat to anyone. But enough. The unit. The coin. What Thomas had said. I told her about 16 years of service, and a record that listed him as a training instructor because the truth was classified. I told her about the places that don't appear on any official itinerary. I told her about what Thomas had said, that David was one of the best he ever worked with. My mother was quiet for a long time. He never said anything, she said. Her voice was different, smaller. No, I said. I thought he was. I don't know what I thought. I thought he was just quiet. He was quiet, I said. That was part of it. Another silence. And we never. She stopped. I didn't fill the silence for her. Some silences need to be sat in. He knew, I said finally. I think he understood that you didn't know. I don't think he was waiting for an apology. I think he was okay with it, in his way. That was how he was built. He didn't need the credit, but he deserved it, my mother said. Yes, I said. He did. I went back to Clarksville in the spring. The grave had settled by then, the way graves do. The VFW had placed a marker I had called Raymond, who had made some calls, which is how things seem to get done in the world that David had moved through, and the marker listed his name, his dates, and his branch of service. Nothing about his unit. That wasn't the kind of thing that gets listed on markers. But people who know what the marker doesn't say. I brought the coin. I had been carrying it for months by then, in my coat pocket mostly, taking it out sometimes in the same automatic way I had seen him hold things careful, present. I understood now why its edges were worn. I stood at the grave for a long time. It was a Thursday, cold still, but with that early spring quality where you can feel the warmth trying to push through. A cardinal landed on the branch of the nearest tree and sat there for a moment like it had somewhere to be but wasn't in a hurry. I didn't put the coin down. I had thought about it, whether to leave it with him. But Thomas had said, it doesn't leave the family. And David had kept it, which meant he had wanted it kept. So I kept it. What I did instead was this. I stood at the grave, and I said out loud the things I wished I had said to him when I had the chance. I told him I was sorry I hadn't visited more. I told him about finishing the Korean War book, which I had, in February, staying up past midnight, to get through the last 50 pages, and I told him my summary of it, which I think he would have had opinions about. I told him about the diner, and Sandra, who had started a small collection among the Tuesday regulars to plant something in his honor in the small garden outside the diner door. Tomatoes. I told him I understood now. Not all of it, most of it I would never understand. And that was appropriate. But the shape of it, the choice to carry it quietly, the way some people move through the world doing the thing that needs doing without asking anyone to watch. The cardinal was still in the tree when I turned to leave. I stopped and looked at it for a moment, which I don't usually do. I'm not a stop and look at birds kind of person, generally. But something about that morning made me slow down. My brother Marcus called me the following week. Not a text, a call. He asked how I was, and then he asked if it was true, what Mom had told him about David. I said it was. He was quiet for a while. I didn't know, he said. Nobody did, I said. But you went to the funeral, he said. When nobody else did. Yes, I said. Why? He said. It wasn't accusatory. It was a real question. I thought about how to answer it. About the particular weight of a coin worn smooth from years of handling. About a man who sat at the edge of every room he entered, not because he was outside of things, but because he had learned to see more clearly from there. About a garden maintained in winter because the garden would need to be ready in spring, and someone had to do the work even when the result was still invisible. Because he was there, I said. That's all. He was always there, even when none of us were paying attention. The least I could do was show up. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. I should have gone, he said. Yes, I said. I didn't say it gently, and I didn't say it harshly. Just plainly. You should have. Another silence. Longer this time. Is there anything left? From his things? I have the coin, I said. And a photograph I'm not sure how to identify. And a letter I haven't decided whether to open. What kind of coin? And so I told him. The same way Thomas had told me, with that same careful steadiness. I told him about the unit, about the 16 years, about the places that don't appear on official records. I told him what Thomas had said, that David was one of the best operators he ever worked with, and I heard my brother's breathing change on the other end of the line. God, Marcus said finally. And we just let him sit there. Yes, I said. For years. Yes. I heard him exhale. A long, slow breath. Why didn't he say anything? Because that's not who he was, I said. He did the work. He didn't need the audience. I paused. But Marcus, that's not an excuse. For us. For not owing up. He didn't need us to know what he did. He just needed us to know him. And we didn't do that. I didn't do that enough either. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you do with that? It was the right question. Probably the most important question. I don't know, I said honestly. I think you start paying attention. To the quiet people. To the ones who don't say much at dinner. The ones who help carry boxes without being asked and leave before dessert. The ones who have done things you'll never fully know about. I thought about the coin in my nightstand drawer, next to the finished library book. You don't wait for them to tell you who they are. You show up. The letter is still sealed. I've thought about opening it many times. I've held it up to a light, as if I could read it through the envelope, which of course I couldn't. I've set it on my kitchen table and looked at it over coffee and then put it back. Some evenings I take it out and just hold it, the same way I hold the coin. That same automatic weight. I think I'll open it eventually. When the time is right, though I couldn't tell you how I'll know when that is. There's something about it that doesn't feel finished yet, like there's a question the letter is waiting for me to be ready to ask. In the meantime, I keep the coin. I carry it sometimes in my coat pocket on days when I'm doing something difficult, which I recognize, sounds strange, but I find it steadying. That weight, that worn edge. The knowledge of what it represents, not just the official thing, the unit and the years and the classified record, but the human thing underneath all of that. A man who chose to do hard work in the dark, without applause, because someone had to and he was the person who could. There is a kind of courage that looks like silence. I didn't understand that before. I'm still learning what it means. What I know is this. The quiet people in your life are not quiet because they have nothing to say. Some of them are quiet because what they carry is too heavy, or too classified, or too far beyond the vocabulary of ordinary dinner conversation to put into words easy. Some of them are quiet because they decided long ago that the work was more important than the credit, and they have lived by that decision so long and so completely that they wouldn't know how to ask for recognition even if they wanted it. Pay attention to those people. Not when it's convenient. Not when the logistics line up. Not after they're gone. Now, while there is still time, while they are still sitting at the edge of the room with a glass of sweet tea they haven't touched, watching everything with that steady, careful attention. Go sit next to them. Ask them about their garden. Listen like it matters because it does, even when you can't see how yet. That's what I would tell myself, if I could go back. I would stop walking past the edge of the room. I would pull up a chair. I would stay.